Can we be heard from the table, or should we use the microphone?
You can use the microphone from the table.
Oh, we can use the microphone from the table.
There's a compromise.
Okay, there we go. Yes? Yeah, there we go. Okay, so welcome everyone. We're having one of the thematics. Our music department at Berkeley is interested in this year's improvisation, and so I've been learning a bit from them about how to improv. I'm obviously not Robin Derby, who is supposed to be moderating this panel, so I'm going to be doing a little of sort of on-the-spot improv, just to introduce the fellows who will be presenting their work in fairly short segments. So each panelist will speak for somewhere between 5 and 10 minutes at the outside, to give us 7 minutes at the outside, and then I'd like to invite the panelists to respond to one another before turning this over to you for your questions and hopefully dialogue and conversation. So first up will be Michele SALZMAN from history at UC Riverside. We'll follow the order of the program. Then KENDRA Field, also UC Riverside, history. Frank Bliss, UC San Diego. BIESS San Diego, apologies. And finally, Roxanne Varzi from UC Irvine. So I think, Michele, I'll ask you to begin.
Okay. So I have a soft voice, I know. So can you hear me now? No. How's that? Okay. Yeah. All right. I think I need it, I think. Well, I'm very happy to have had the opportunity to read Kendra Field's work. And just to remind you all, the instructions that we had were to, 1, summarize the other scholars' work, 2, explore ways that work illuminates, challenges, enlarges your own, and 3, pose prompting questions. So I'll do that. And I found it a wonderful opportunity. Kendra's book project, Growing Up with the Country, A Family History of Race and American Expansion, documents the migration and settlement of African Americans from the Deep South to Indian Territory after the Civil War. And I should preface this by saying I'm a Roman historian, so this is very virgin territory for me. Her work explores this journey both as movement toward freedom and as expansion of the United States empire, she puts it. Kendra shows how African American migrants in Indian Territory sought freedom through a series of experiments in farming and land ownership. These actions, which took place between around 1880 and 1910, maybe 20, show the ways in which, fascinating ways in which African Americans migrants contributed really to the expansion of the U.S. And also how they also engaged simultaneously in really economic and political negotiations with Indians, in negotiations over lands at that time. And as you see these African American actors, you can see that they're negotiating as well, eventually also with white settlers and oil speculators. So this migration that Kendra documents shows the ways in which their attempted control over Oklahoma lands eventually ran into problems that resulted in part of Jim Crow laws and growing political discrimination in the early part of the 20th century. And so Kendra argues that the African Americans turned once more to migration as a solution to these political problems. And these African Americans who had gone to Oklahoma are enticed to migrate once more either to West Africa or to Mexico in search of freedom and economic independence on the eve of America's involvement in World War I. So one of the things that Kendra does by investigating these African Americans and Native Americans as actors on the frontier, Oklahoma really is a frontier, is to really uncover some really unexpected and rather complex realities of life in Oklahoma. So she finds Native Americans as slave owners and African Americans as settlers on Indian land. And she does this really by uncovering the stories of individuals, individual families in particular, And it's a fascinating and much more complicated history of America on the eve of its entrance into World War I than I would have thought. Indeed, one of the great contributions to the work, I think, is KENDRA's extensive research into the records and accounts of 4 particular families, some of whose members are from within KENDRA's own family. And she connects their reactions to growing racism and political difficulties in Oklahoma with much larger movements. The chapter that she shared with me in particular I found fascinating. She was tracing the interconnection of two families, the Monroes and the Davises, and their involvement in something called the Chief Sam movement. This was a little known and insignificant back to Africa separatist movement that began in Oklahoma and ended on the west coast of Africa. And most historians who talk about it see it as, I'm quoting from her, pointless exercise of a disenfranchised group. But what KENDRA does by exploring the individuals involved in this movement is to argue, I think quite rightly, that this was another migration. Just as African Americans had migrated from the south to Oklahoma in the face of growing political difficulties, they migrated again to West Africa. And they weren't totally successful there, but still it's part of a sort of a pattern of dealing with crisis, as it were, dealing with problems, political problems, growing racism in the post-Reconstructionist America. And her work, her insights into this movement grow, as I said, out of 2 families. She does a lot of family history. Monroe Coleman and Alexandra Ellick Davis. And she has some wonderfully telling details about the differences between these 2 families and these 2 men. Monroe Coleman, who benefited from having a white plantation father and was hence educated, although he migrated, he came back and eventually was successful in Oklahoma, versus what happened to Alexander Ellick Davis, who was fully black and went to Oklahoma and then migrated to West Africa, but had a very unhappy afterlife as a result of his migrations. The telling detail in her work is really quite striking. The young Monroe, who successfully migrated, was educated in school by day because he could pass for white, while Davis had to work by day and had to study his cousin's books by night. So she shows quite clearly the cost of racism as it played out in the lives of these 2 men and their 2 families. I found it a fascinating project, and I'm looking forward to finding out more about what happened to the families. I could go on summarizing, but I won't. I'm going to move on to part 2 and try to reflect a little bit about how KENDRA's work illuminates or enlarges my own. You haven't heard about my work yet, so I'll briefly say that my project considers the falls of Rome and how the inhabitants of the city of Rome, not the empire, faced a string of military and political crises over a 300-year period, and their responses arose in part out of intergroup competition, in part out of a memory of past responses to crisis. And my work focuses in particular on how these responses shape the physical spaces and hence civic identities of the inhabitants of Rome after the fall of the Western Empire. So I was particularly struck by several things in KENDRA's project. She quotes from de Tocqueville, talking about America. De Tocqueville makes a comparison between the mass movements in America when white settlers migrated to Alabama and Mississippi, and he made the connection between this mass migration with that which happened after the fall of the Roman Empire. And it got me to thinking about migration. And indeed, reading KENDRA's work has made me realize that one of the reactions to the falls of Rome really is migration. The migration not simply of the Germanic peoples coming into Rome, creating the crisis, the political and military crisis, but also the migration of Romans themselves who had to leave the city, and how that might be folded into my own work more thoroughly, as it were. I'm also very envious of Kendra. She's got a lot of documentation. She can tell what people feel after they moved, after they migrated. Unfortunately, we don't have much information about how the Germanic tribes felt or what even made them move down to Rome. But I do know more about the Romans who left, and perhaps that should be part of my story as I was thinking. Particularly the movement into ascetic Christianity. And certain women we know fled Rome and started their own ascetic communities in Jerusalem and the Holy Land. That could be part of my story. The other thing that I found very suggestive is the idea of place-based history. Kendra quotes from Ralph Ellison saying, "Geography is fate." And she tries to talk about that in terms of both land acquisition by African Americans in Oklahoma, and the dream of it in West Africa. So similarly, the notion of the site of Rome as fate for the people who respond to crisis there is something that I find very intriguing. And so too, the importance of family history is something that I think is very richly shown by her work. And I can also use that more in my own work on what happens to families. Don't know how much time I'm taking, but
Another couple of minutes.
I've got a couple of minutes, good. So for instance, that's family-based history is something that I think we share in common. So moving on to part 3, what kind of further questions might I have for Kendra? I am a Roman historian, and it's clear what I mean by empire. I mean an empire with a princeps and a senate and an army, and military under their control. But when I was reading her talking about the American empire, it wasn't quite clear to me what kind of empire Kendra was talking about. And as an historian, it would be very helpful for her to have a more, I think, a deeper appreciation of the term empire and the connotations it has across different fields. More appreciation, I read the book prospectus, but one of the things that really struck me was the importance of the individual, but I also wondered about the relationship between the individual and the numbers of people involved. How many African Americans went to Oklahoma? How many to Mexico? How many went to West Africa? How many came back? I don't know how, if we can compare them to other kinds of migrations. We talk about subsequent migrations in the 20th century, and it would be really helpful to an outsider to have some sense of numbers. So those are some further work that would be helpful in contextualizing the significance of what she's talking about. One of the most intriguing things that I found was a quote that she used, again, talking about the role of memory in history, because part of her work focuses on family histories and family individuals remembering what happened to their ancestors. And so, telling a wonderful quote from Richard Wright, "History may be the enemy of memory, but there are regions of the past that only memory knows." And I thought that was a very important quote that she could contextualize more. It would be interesting to know how the people that you talk about, the ancestors of Davis, what kinds of forces were working on them as they remembered their ancestors. So really, I guess, an urge, a desire to counterbalance the individual fates with the fates of larger numbers of African Americans in Africa and Oklahoma, and also connect the people who are remembering with the world in which they came from. So that's just some ideas. We'll have much more time to talk, I hope, now and also in Riverside.
Okay, great. Thank you. So now we'll hear from...
So should we respond at the end, or do I respond and then I
think we'll leave the responses for the end, because we're doing this sort of round robin presentations.
Okay. Thank you very much, Michelle. So I'm going to be speaking briefly about Professor BIESS's work and his current book project. And I was really excited in the end, to have this opportunity, although in the beginning I had the feeling of the huge leap. I was jumping to post-1945 West Germany, about which I know not much. And so in the end, though, I found some really interesting connections here, so it was a fun project. So Professor Biess's book project, German Angst, documents the history of fear and anxiety in post-war West Germany. Reaching beneath the dominant narratives of successful stabilization and liberal democratization, Professor Biess reveals a more troubling history of recurrent fear and anxiety after 1945. He draws on published materials as well as diaries, letters, autobiographies, and government records, and in doing so, he presents a collection of case studies that illustrate a succession of shifting objects of fear and anxiety between the 1940s and 1980s. And he's also in the process tracing the evolving cultural norms that circumscribe the experience and expression of these emotions, and draws on Walter Reddy's concept of an emotional regime. In so doing, he's contributing to a vibrant and really growing literature on the history of emotions that was recently highlighted in a special issue of the American Historical Review and has gotten a lot of much needed and overdue attention. So one of the chapters that I had the opportunity to read is called Moral Panic in Post-War Germany, and it analyzes the public obsession in West Germany with the Foreign Legion during the 1950s, illuminating the importance of fears and fantasies in post-war society. Part of the problem is that the dominant story, it seems, of recovery, both economic and political, has until now left little room for this kind of a story of how West Germans were also haunted during this period by ghosts and folk devils, and how their memories of traumatic violence shaped their perception of ongoing threats to the social and moral order of their present and future lives. In the immediate aftermath of the war, this kind of energy around fear and anxiety, Professor Biess suggests, was largely focused on external, or what were perceived to be external threats, namely post-war occupation and the Cold War. Having said that, one of the most compelling aspects of this book, and I think of this history, is the shift that Biess documents from external threats to internal ones, or those that were emanating from within West German society and in fact, individual subjects, beginning in the 1960s onward. So the story culminates with the peace movements of the 1980s, new conceptions of selfhood and subjectivity, and an expanded capacity, Biess writes, for the expression and articulation of fear and anxiety. Even where recent historians have exposed the ongoing legacies of of war, fascism, and defeat, Biess tells us the precise ways in which memories of the past informed post-war Germans' considerable sense of uncertainty, fear, and indeed panic regarding their future, that's a quote, are only gradually coming into focus through works such as this. So I'll speak briefly about what this generated for me. The first is kind of the very basic notion of complicating the transition, right? Complicating more convenient narratives of a single event. So in my own work in 19th century U.S. and African American history among scholars of the U.S. South, and specifically the American Civil War, I've been interested in the recent movement away from the quote-unquote event of emancipation and towards documenting a longer and more complicated transition from slavery to freedom. And as such, Professor Biess's commitment and approach in this book to the aftermath, and more pointedly to the underside of the coming of democracy, the ways in which he disrupts linear and, as he puts it, teleological narratives, rings quite true for me and seems to be a really critical contribution to a more complicated and complete understanding of how change indeed happens. More specifically, I was struck by the attention that he gives to the psychic and emotional weight that West Germans carried with them into their future. That is, how emotions, and also their various forms of expression, are mobilized for specific social and political ends. In North American history, and in my field, we know far too well and have been focused for quite some time on how often we've missed the who, of history. Groups of people who have been wholly left out of the dominant narratives of our official reckonings with the past. But Professor Biess's work points us in a different, equally important direction, I think, suggesting that we are just beginning to fathom how many dimensions of the how we've also missed, how people experienced not only material circumstances and collective action, but trauma and collective feeling. Because BIESS writes about emotions, however unwieldy, as distinctly causal forces in their own right. And this was a little bit radical for me. And because the world, I'm so following the people all the time, but I really learned a lot from this. And because he's writing about them as causal forces in their own right, and because the work engages folk devils and other kind of fearful imaginings, in the margins of his argument, I found myself being reminded of Dipesh Chakrabarty's discussion of agency, about translating life worlds, gods, spirits, and the supernatural, and about the possibility of subaltern histories in which humans are not the only meaningful agents. As in post-war Germany, in the immediate post-Civil War American South that I studied, we see a society rife with paranoia about the failure of manhood and in turn nation. Long before a narrative, whether it's a narrative about the war, the nation, the past, or the future, long before these narratives get woven, in this immediate post-war moment, this paranoia conspires with deep economic insecurity and the pervasive available racial ideology of turn-of-the-century America, in turn engendering a half-century of widespread vigilante violence and thousands of lynchings, all in the name of a return to so-called home rule. Secondly, I wanted to talk about Professor Biess's attention to memory. As a methodological approach, Biess's focus on what he calls culturally significant moments of heightened popular attention, what we might call cultural or collective memory, was quite compelling for me. In his study of the Civil War and American memory, the U.S. historian David Blight reminds us that the vigor with which white Americans, both Union and Confederate, celebrated the 50-year anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg, recreating the battlefield minus the thousands of black soldiers who had participated, or storming the theaters to imbibe the mythical narrative that D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation was selling, that all of this was a direct response to a form of collective reckoning with the political, cultural, physical, and emotional trauma of the war and its aftermath, a way of papering over the memory of conflict and repairing the white American, in this case, body politic, with the salve, as it were, of new narratives about the past and the future. And Biess notes that his project employs memory not only as a retroactive, but also as a perspective category, which I really liked, exploring how post-war Germans' past experiences of violence and suffering structured their anticipation of the future. That's a quote. In my own work, this prompts me to consider how Southerners' experiences of war and societal upheaval may have structured, in fact did structure, their approaches to the so-called New South and the rise of a newly racially and nationally and extremely rigidly ordered Jim Crow society. And it gets me thinking about the cultural norms that govern forms of emotional expression in the post-emancipation period. So Professor Biess talks about a new emotional regime that emerged by the 1960s and that made valid the public expression and performance of emotions, as he says, as an indicator of political authenticity and even healthy subjectivity. He writes that this dramatic cultural shift enabled the successful mobilization of emotions into the peace movement of the 1980s. And then jumping to my work from this, in the case of the 4 million free people who were largely silenced after the demise of Reconstruction and certainly the rise of Jim Crow, and depending on how we might define success, I began to wonder if we might imagine the Harlem Renaissance 30 years later and the New Negro movement 2 generations later as a parallel moment of successful mobilization of emotions. In short, while I've thought a good deal until now about the circulation of ideas and politics and culture, about the ways in which free people's dreams of land ownership and community formation were built in the crucible of slavery and the war, Biess's methodological approach encouraged me to think more deliberately about the emotional register upon which, an emotional regime within which, free people experienced the trauma and violent upheaval of the Civil War, Reconstruction, and the half-century of violence and domestic terrorism that followed. Social historians of Reconstruction, the post-emancipation period, over the past 4 decades, have tended to read all that we find there for its political text and subtext, often blinded by an arguably dated, if understandable, intellectual attachment to agency and resistance, the primary lens through which we've read the archives since roughly the Civil Rights Movement. But rarely have we considered emotional expression as a category worthy of consideration in its own right. And in this sense, Professor Biess's work seems to me a very brave and important step in the right direction for his field as well as mine, and perhaps for historiographies even further afield. Okay, so as the authors of the recent conversation in the AHR wrote the American Historical Review wrote recently. The study of emotions has become a thriving pursuit among historians from many different areas and periods. Not only does its emergence as a legitimate subfield foster the interrogation of descriptors, love, hate, resentment, passions, pity, happiness, and the like, that historians are more often to use uncritically, if at all, it also allows for the crossing of the boundaries between private and public, the personal and the collective, that often constrain our work. So one of the questions that they raise, and that I would like to pose here, is whether and how historians can access the emotional lives of people in past times. So in their words, is it possible to go beyond emotional expressions, usually conveyed in language, and attain some assurance that these are indicative of actual emotional states? I would add, I think, to this the question of disparity across emotional lives, even within a single period. So we know that, first of all, people express themselves in vastly different ways, and second of all, that some people's lives are more or less accessible, particularly their emotional lives. So I'm wondering about how we can balance and how you are balancing the who and the how in order to tackle these kinds of disparities within the archive. Second question, more specific to your project, how do different populations within West Germany manifest the fears and anxieties that you are tracing within the kind of imagined community? My third question is, just I would love to hear you talk a little bit more about the strengths and limitations of the archive for the kind of story that you're telling. And then lastly, you write about emotions functioning as historical agents and as a causal force in their own right. And I would love to hear more about this and about the unique contribution it represents within this newly emerging historiography of emotions. Thank you.
Great. So I think we'll just keep moving right on. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Kendra. I think one of the really productive elements of this sort of panel is that we're all forced to step outside of our comfort zone and engage with topics and themes that we usually don't engage with and don't know much about it. But I was actually very gratified to hear your rendition of my project because I could recognize in your summary what I wanted to accomplish. So it's good to know that it doesn't always happen. It can sometimes be rather disturbing, but in this case it was actually the opposite. So thank you very much. I think I was actually probably the luckiest person on this panel because I only got a very short article to read, not the 40 pages or so that you needed to read. But in fewer than 10 pages, Roxanne Varzi actually manages to accomplish a lot. She complicates our understanding of the origins and the outcome of one of the most formative moments in the 20th century, namely the Iranian Revolution in 1979. Starting from the seemingly paradoxical observation of Iranian protesters using Islam against an Islamic regime in 2009, Varzi unearths some of the lesser known and very surprising philosophical origins of the revolution 30 years earlier. Her focus is on the Hegelian philosopher Henri Corbin, who taught in both Tehran and Paris, as well as on the Marxist and post-colonial thinker Khalal al-Ahmad, who was also a committed Muslim. Varzi reminds us that the Iranian Revolution cannot be reduced to its later outcome, Islamic fundamentalism, and she highlights the multidirectional efficacy of ideas, their capacity to migrate to new places and to assume new meanings in different contexts. We had the emphasis on the migration of people in the two earlier papers. Here it's really about the migration of ideas. So in her rendition, Hegelianism serves as an inspiration for the Islamic State. Marxism is perfectly compatible with Islam, and existentialism becomes a source of Khomeini's critique of Western imperialism. No wonder then that Michel Foucault was famously intrigued by the Iranian Revolution, even though, to quote Varzi, he completely misunderstood, misinterpreted, misheard, or was not privy to Khomeini's intentions to deploy an Islamic republic. Varzi also complicates our understanding of Islamic politics. she argues that the protesters of the contemporary oppositional Green movement did not simply, or do not simply advocate a return to a pre-revolutionary Iran. Rather, they seek to recover some of the lost legacies of the revolution, including a valorization of mysticism and spiritualism. And precisely because the Green movement reminds the Islamic State of some of its own repressed origins, it constitutes a more dangerous adversary than a purely secular movement would be. The Green movement's mysticism and spiritualism also makes it possible to immediately assimilate the victim of the Iranian regime's violence as new martyrs, and she actually ends with a brief discussion of video footage of the death of one woman protester in 2009, and it reminded me of our discussion last night of the significance of documentary photography and video for the purposes of political protest. Now, one way to perhaps evaluate research is to consider its impact on teaching. And Vazi's paper basically forces me to do more work and to revise the one lecture on the Iranian Revolution that I have and that I regularly give in my lower division 20th century world history course. The Iranian Revolution, I usually tell the students, was significant because it was the first successful revolution that did not draw on a Western model, either liberal or Marxist, but rather mobilized religion as a revolutionary force. Now, Vazi's short paper shows me that this is obviously maybe not entirely wrong, but certainly reductive, and that the revolution was actually driven by a very creative hybrid between Islamic thought and various other elements of the Western intellectual tradition. This reconfiguration of Islamic thought both confirms and transcends what historian Dipesh Chakrabarty has famously called the provincializing of Europe. The revolution combined developmental Western models such as Hegelianism and Marxism, what Chakrabarty calls History 1, with mysticism and spiritualism, what he calls the time of gods and spirits, or History 2. The migration of ideas from Paris to Tehran and back shows, however, that the provincializing of Europe did not just take place in the colonial spaces outside of the West, but within Europe as well. European intellectual traditions, in other words, might have been more polyvalent, more flexible than Chakrabarty's notion of what he calls a hyper-real Europe, which is different from the actual Europe, might allow. To be fair, for Chakrabarty, Heidegger also serves as an antidote to totalizing conceptions of history. And it's perhaps no accident that Roxane tells us that her Iranian interlocutors are actually infatuated with being in time, which she describes, quote, as a very German word. And I'm not sure if this is meant as a compliment or as a criticism. In Vazi's attempt to bring together seemingly incongruent elements into a common framework, I also see similarities to my own attempts of challenging what I think is a predominant view, certainly in the post-war period, of fear and anxiety as liberal democracies' others. This goes back to the political scientist Judith Sklar, who has basically defined liberalism as the opposite, or as a way of containing fear and anxiety. But Vazi shows how European intellectual traditions were perfectly compatible with Islam, and I try to show how fear and anxiety both enhanced and at times disrupted the process of democratization and liberalization in post-war Germany. Now, let me just end with one sort of more extended question, and that has to do with the sort of the question whether we can put the thinking of Koba and Ahmad and the Iranian Revolution more general into a more global and transnational context. To what extent it was part and parcel of a global resurgence and politicization of religion in the 1970s. The establishment of an Islamic Republic in Iran coincided with the rise of Jewish fundamentalism, for example, in the wake of the 1967 war, and of course also with the emergence of the Christian right in this country in the 1970s, to be followed a little bit later by a renewed politicization of Hindu nationalism in India. So one question would be, what explains this global resurgence of religion in different localities? And how does this transnational or global perspective cast a new light on the Iranian Revolution? Because if we place the Iranian Revolution into this global context, it all of a sudden no longer appears as an atavistic aberration from an allegedly relentless path of secularization as it has often been portrayed in the West. Rather, it might be seen as a harbinger of an alternative form of late 20th and early 20th century modernity that appeared in different forms in other places as well. What makes Varzi's intellectual protagonists so interesting, I think, is that they disrupt the association of this new religious politics with the political right, with neoliberal orthodoxy, and with neo-imperialism, as it was forged in Iran and in the West during the 70s and the 80s. So who would have thought that religious thinkers and movements in Tehran emerge as some of the most energetic and innovative advocates of an ongoing contemporary relevance of Marxism and post-colonialism? Thank you.
Wow, thank you. So now we will see what the falls of Rome 270 to 604 look like to a historian of the 1979 Iranian Revolution.
I'm actually, can you hear me? Can you hear me? I'm an anthropologist, so it really looks funny to me. I have to admit that I haven't thought about the fall or the falls of Rome since high school Latin class, and all I remember from that is my first declension, and probably incorrectly. Michele Salzman's book project focuses on the city of Rome and what it means to say that it fell. Her interest in the shift of Rome from pagan to Christian, which she argues happens gradually. She shows that the downturn of the city was not inevitable, nor was it the result of a sudden catastrophic moment, but rather as a series of events. The idea of crisis and fall, sorry, I'm not used to reading off of this, so I'm not looking up much, lend a temporal notion of a sudden change rather than a process that is the first place where I see a parallel with my own current work on the Iranian Revolution, where I'm also arguing that it was a process and an informed intellectual one at that. Salzman argues that as a result of the contestation of elites, Rome changed physically and ideologically, as did, of course, post-revolution Iran. I like Salzman's emphasis on what Walter Benjamin would call the thingness of the city. Its physicality, especially in respect to ideology and religious ideology at that. As Henri Lefebvre says, power is made visible through the use of social space in particular. When a dictator falls, so does his statue. Sorry, I can't. This is so small. Salzman points to how in response to crisis, Aurelian turned to religion to rebuild Rome by dedicating the largest temple to the sun god in the city. In my first book on Iran, I wrote at length about the ideological shifts in the city where the Shah's old cabarets became sandwich shops and the vineyards in Shiraz became kids' grape juice packs, and how later, during the Iran-Iraq War, Tehran and other major cities were mapped with martyr visuals. Islam is interpreted by Khomeini as a radical and innovative force for change produced spatially and visually throughout Iran, helped consolidate the power of the new government. And one question I'm curious about, and I've asked her privately, and it's a huge discussion, is how martyrdom and the culture of martyrdom played into some of the sort of ideological shifts in Rome and how that shifted the city maybe physically. I'm curious why Aurelian saw these opportunities in religion and how an historian would determine his motivation. After all, building of a temple could just as easily have been a concession of sorts. I'm guessing that comes into the textual rather than the archaeological work. Salzman's paper has me thinking about archaeology and the various layers of history that we sift through to get to any present or past moment that we hope to magnify and somehow explicate. I think of my own work in Iran as an archaeology of the present, because there are so many different visual and physical layers, beginning with the top layer, or the surface that was constructed by the government, that keeps the outside from seeing what is really happening in daily life of the average citizens at home below the public surface. I had to go below the political surface to see the trends and to look at what SALZMAN refers to as the rhythm of urban life, which she finds had little impact on Constantine's pronouncements, like Sunday as a day of rest, which is very similar to 3/4 of Tehran's population that doesn't really see Friday as a day of prayer. There are interesting parallels in her work and mine in terms of finding these places of resistance to religious change and cautioning readers of history that change takes time, especially religious change. Iranians in particular have a history of having resisted very quick religious change, as we saw with the Arab invasion. They continue to practice their Zoroastrian practices underground. And this happens as well with secular people who continue to practice secular life underground in the Islamic Republic. I've noticed over the years how even reading in the present takes on a different tack depending on discipline. Reading Michele Salzman's paper made me think a lot about discipline and how we have different outcomes or narratives. Like even in Iran, as an anthropologist, looking at the way that political scientists in particular engage with Iran is to sort of look at how they engage with the surface. And anytime that you're going to look at the surface in Iran, you're going to see Islam. If you look beyond the surface, you may see something different. Even archaeologically, you're going to see Islam. But if you look beyond, you're going to see a daily practice, thoughts, hopes, and dreams that might point to something else. So I admit we learn a lot from history, and I was a little bit intimidated about working with a historian's work, but I found that there were so many interesting parallels between hyper-modern Iranian revolution and Rome. And the first thing that I found on Salzman's very early on in her piece was this description of the major competing groups in Rome from 270 to 603 CE, the senatorial aristocracy, the imperial bureaucracy, the ecclesiastical leadership, and the Germanic military leadership, as each strove for dominance in the face of crisis. Based on archaeological evidence, she argues that it is this contestation among these groups, conditioned by previous resolutions to crisis and memories of these events, which led to the reconstructing of urban institutions and spaces, even as the city's inhabitants came to create a new Christian and civic identity. And that was a quote. Many call for caution when labeling Iran's revolution as Islamic because it didn't necessarily begin that way. Because so many people came to the fore as post-colonial activists, secular activists, Marxists, feminists, all contesting the Shah, and they helped sort of formulate and spark a revolution. When Salzman says that Christianity is dominant among the elites, but that Christianity emerges and is shaped by competition for influence by secular and ecclesiastical elites, I think of Iran just prior to the revolution in my current archival and historic project, and I have to say that there are some strong similarities, which is why revolutionary Islam and what was practiced before are not necessarily the same practice. And I think that's some of the point that you're trying to make about how Roman citizens sort of practice and find this sort of daily practice of Christianity that shifts over time. Mm-hmm. On that note, it was a pleasure to read about the falls of Rome, and many of my ruminations on the disciplinary differences in our work are really about my own anxiety as I move deeper into my next project on Henri Corbin that is mainly archival and an archaeology of a person's life for whom I have many questions, but of course he's passed away. I'm curious what questions Salzman would ask if she were able to go back in time and question the inhabitants as they were experiencing the transition. Because even as one who was able to do this in Iran, I did my field work in Iran on secular youth, formulating the right question and tactics were not always so obvious to me. For example, to get at how much an ideological space seeped into a person's subconscious, I had to ask self-defined secular youth about the symbolism in their dreams. This after learning from an art historian friend of Turkey that Ataturk often appeared as a bust in people's dreams and as an angry father, which I thought was kind of interesting. So I thought, yeah, I'll ask them about their dreams. And this kind of goes back to some of what KENDRA was saying about how do we sort of determine what people's emotions or feelings were as historians. It's easy as an anthropologist. It's not so easy. It still has its tactics. But I'm just curious how Michele would do that and what she would want to ask if she were able to be an anthropologist in the moment. How did the Romans manage the shift? What did it look like? What did it feel like? How will the recent archaeological finds that Salzman refers to change the history and particularly her writing of the history of the falls of Rome, and what texts in particular were overlooked by other historians who have written on the topic. I'm guessing that Leo's sermon was one of them. Khomeini must have been a reader of Leo's sermons when he said that after the sack of Rome, Leo claimed that God saved the city. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you all. I think we'll allow the panelists a very brief few minutes to either respond or ask a question of one another, and then we'll open this up for your questions and comments and general discussion. I just want to say it's been really fascinating to see how the echoes and responses and questions back and forth have already been accumulating across the panel, and I think this is now a chance just to go around once again before we open it up for questions.
I guess I get to go first.
We'll start back at the...
Okay. Thank you. That was wonderful. And I do think that there's a lot of resonance between the four papers, although I would never have thought that looking at the titles. Did I hear you correctly that Khomeini said that? Or is that
No. I'm guessing.
You're guessing.
You dreamt it.
One of the things, when I read Kendra's paper, I kept on thinking, I should have been an American historian. You could ask people you could actually access their daily lives. One of the reasons why I work on elites is because that's the stuff that survives. And I do use texts, and I am trying to decenter the typical narrative about the decline and fall by reading texts that are not usually read for these purposes. So Pope Leo, who is a mid-5th century pope, often called Pope Leo the Great, and because he wrote so much, he formalized the church. He was a pope for 20 years, and he lived through two incredibly terrible crises. Vandals' sack being one of them, and the sack of Rome in 410 probably. So I'm trying to get at other voices, but emotions are very, not just about impossible, but they're very hard because of the rhetorics involved. So that when St. Jerome talks about the sack of Rome in 410 and the horrors and the terrors of it, he's really in a letter that he's trying to convince a woman to become an ascetic and go to Jerusalem and give up on Rome, and she does, according to the letter. So you can get at some of the emotions, but they're very often manipulated emotions. We don't have the ability to go back and ask, even though the questions would be hard. I couldn't go back and ask Constantine, what was he thinking before you attacked Rome on the night before the Milvian Bridge? Believe it or not, I often had dreams about that. When I was a graduate student, I kept on dreaming, okay, I'll go back to ancient Rome, and then I'll have to really talk Latin. And it was a time, and what would I do? What would I say? So I appreciate the game. I'll have to think about that. But one of the things that I think talks to all of our papers really is what you do with the memory of events. And one of the hard things for my work is to just extract what the memory was and what we can contrast that with what we think happened. Because Jerome's memory of the sack of Rome in 410 is not exactly the way things actually happened from what archaeologists and other sources tell us. So that's why my question to Kendra was, how do you offset the fact that memory is so very constructed?
Kendra?
Sure. Great. So I'm going back to the questions that I got. The first was about empire, the second was about numbers, and then history of memory. And that's probably building up to my favorite topic. So yeah, that's a really great question, and one that I will certainly work on defining further for multiple audiences. So in U.S. history in the long 19th century, for those of you that are in that field, the recent work has tried to kind of get away from 1898 as the start of U.S. imperialism U.S. imperialism period, and begin to think about the fact that the U.S. was a very kind of undone and in process nation throughout most of the 19th century, or at least in the antebellum period. And so scholars like Walter Johnson and Adam Rothman, who I've kind of followed behind, have helped me to kind of think about early settlement of what was the Old Southwest, then became the Deep South, as in many ways a settlement that we can speak of as settler imperialist in certain ways. And that has to do with kind of how people were envisioning the land and what their relationship was, especially to indigenous peoples of the Old Southwest, so the Creek, the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and the Seminole Indians. And so that's the literature that my use of imperialism comes out of, but I really agree and would like to do more to kind of define that relative to other fields. So with regard to and so when I'm talking about African Americans as participating in the appropriation of Indian land, that's where that comes from. So with regard to numbers, this has really been kind of a subject close to my heart, because the relationship between individuals and the collective. So I can give you the number that approximately 100,000 African Americans migrated from the Deep South to Indian Territory before it became the state of Oklahoma between 1890 and 1908 or so. And that's, if we do the math, about 1 in 40 or so people who were living in the South after the Civil War, particularly about 1 in 40 African Americans. There were also lots of white settlers who were moving westward during this period as the railroads expanded westward. But the argument that I make, given that's not a small number, but a lot of these are small numbers, and if you look at any given migration, like the Exodus or movement from the Deep South to Kansas, that Nell Painter's written about, or other back to Africa movements that are underway between and roughly the end of Reconstruction and World War I, the numbers do appear rather small. But what I think is, what I found, in fact, is that this movement mattered to the people that stayed behind. And so when I've gone back and spoken with the branches of families that remained in Mississippi, they had a living, breathing memory of the family members and branches of the family that went on to Oklahoma, right? The idea of a more free place was something both before and after the event of emancipation that was incredibly real for people. And I think that that's something that I've tried to kind of drive home in my work. The other thing I'll say about that, and I'll turn it over, is that Stephen Hahn suggested in his book about 10 years ago that this period could be thought of as the early stirrings of the Great Migration. And there's been lots of great books. One great book actually recently by Isabel Wilkerson on the Great Migration, and we know that in elementary education and so forth, that the incredible numbers of the Great Migration. But in fact, this period has been so often thought of as this kind of moment of very static moment in African American history, the nadir of African American history, the lowest point, because of the rise of Jim Crow, the inability to speak out about almost anything, the turning inward that historians have until recently talked about in terms of turning towards the home, towards the church, and other kinds of community formations. And what I think these migrations and kind of digging them up tells us is that people were not actually conforming to that dominant view that we've presented. They have been voting with their feet for a very long time. The Chief Sam movement that Michelle mentioned that I wrote about in the first part of this fellowship year had been framed up until, it hadn't been framed much at all. It was framed in a book in the early 1960s by actually a UC Irvine professor that recently passed away, Professor Gilbert Geis. One of the books that he wrote in the 1950s was about this movement. And it had been framed in the years since that, in the very small attention that I got, as this insignificant precursor to Garveyism. And in fact, what I was able to do was trace the participants of that movement, not just to that movement, but to 3 and sometimes 4 and 5 movements prior to this, and tell their life stories going back to being enslaved children, 5 and 6 years old, at the moment of the end of the Civil War. And this as really the capstone, not the precursor to the Great Migration or Garveyism, but the capstone to what Carter Woodson called a century of Negro migration. I'll turn it over then.
Great.
I'd love to talk about history and memory, but I'm taking too much time.
Great. Go ahead.
Well, what I heard in some of the comments and the questions is, sort of residual skepticism about the possibility of a history of emotions and how should we actually do this. And my answer to this is that I see the history of emotion as only the latest stage in our profession's obsessive drive to historicize every aspect of the human experience. We historicize gender, sexuality, the body, so why not emotions? And I think what also has happened in the past is actually that historians have always invoked emotions in their narratives. They have, there's a well-known history of the Cold War that has a chapter titled The Return of Fear, but they've never really thought about emotions in more conceptual terms, what fear actually is, how it functions. So in some ways, it's just an attempt to sort of increase the level of reflectivity about some of the categories and terms that we use in standard historical narratives. I think it's also a field that offers a lot of opportunities for interdisciplinary cooperation. There are many disciplines in the humanities that are interested in emotions, and one of the key topics in this AHR forum was actually the question to what extent humanities scholars can learn from and use neuroscience and neuroscientific research on emotions. And I have to say there are some aspects of this research that I find relevant. For example, the idea that there is not such a dichotomy between interior and exterior. So the question here, how can we get at emotions as a sort of interior reality? But there's some research that actually shows that the articulation of emotions sort of shapes its very experience. So it's sort of a constitutive element of having an emotion is to say something, to make a statement, I am afraid. Which is what the historian William Reddy calls emotives, a peculiar speech act that has the capacity to sort of alter one's own emotional experience. And as historians, of course, we only have access to emotions once they are articulated in some ways. I don't know the interiority of people who lived in the past, but I can analyze their sort of verbal or visual expressions or articulations of emotions. So these are the sources that we have, but I think they are in fact constitutive of the actual emotion itself. The other comment you made was about this issue of emotions as a causal force. And here I think there is a sort of distinction between writing about emotions in history and writing a history of emotions. If it's emotions in history, they're always a sort of function of some other, presumably more important fact or historical transformation. But part of the ambition would be to show how emotions themselves can have a sort of causal force, how they can enable new kinds of subjectivity, different forms of motivation. And the best example that I think I'll deal with in my own project is indeed this peace movement of the 1980s, where it's very apparent that a new sort of emotional regime that was much more sympathetic to the expression and the public performance of emotions, especially in politics, was absolutely crucial to the sort of motivations and also the sort of social bonds that people in this movement formed, and that basically was constitutive for this actually largest protest movement in the history of post-war West Germany.
So you're basically asking me to explain religious revival in the 20th century? Is that what the question was? No, I'm kidding. I can talk about the Iranian example. I don't know much more than that. I think one of the things that made religion so important in Iran at that time was, first of all, there was a rapid movement to sort of take religion out of the public sphere, and there was a very rapid deveiling of women, which was kind of catastrophic and was maybe too quick. So there was rapid modernization. The other thing that's happening in the 60s in Iran, even though it was never formally colonized, you had England, you had Germany, you had Russia, basically vying for power and sort of settling Iran in sort of different ways throughout World War II. And there was a point where Iranians felt like they sort of, especially Iranian intellectuals, felt like they had lost their identity. And one of the people that they read on this topic, and someone that they really loved, was Frantz Fanon. And this whole idea about a return to self. And for Iranians, what was the return to self? What was that essential thing that was lost? And for a lot of them, they thought, okay, maybe it's Islam. Maybe that's something. Even the ones who are Marxists, even, people from minority religions, they thought that maybe this was a viable sort of national identity that they could sort of hold on to and return to in a sort of way, but in a way that they would reconstruct it. And it became a political reconstruction rather than a spiritual reconstruction, which is interesting. And Corbin, when he went to Iran in the 50s, one of the students of his that I spoke to said that part of the reason he was so attracted to Iran is because he felt that France, a long time ago, had lost its mysticism, and that there was this sort of emptiness philosophically there that he was sort of looking for in the East. And so when he went to Iran, he never converted, which is interesting. He called himself a Shiite Protestant. And later in life, he actually became a Mason, which is, I think, also interesting. He was looking for something. He was seeking something out spiritually. And I could talk a lot about sort of the 50s and that, what was happening intellectually, in places like Ascona, where Corbin was part of a movement with Joseph Campbell and Jung and people who were, Mircea Eliade, who were really sort of thinking about what role religion played in modernization and in modern times. And, Corbin was really interested in angels, and there were all sorts of things that he sort of brought to his teaching of Islam that was very sort of unorthodox. But I think a lot of it was just this political desire to go back to an Iranian self that wasn't determined or dictated by the sort of colonial people that were sitting in Iran at the time.
So I think the room is small enough so that if people want to ask a question, we don't necessarily need a microphone. Yeah.
I actually have a question for KENDRA. So I just turned in for my fellowship last quarter a chapter on charity removal. And so I was wondering if you could speak up. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm asking about charity removal. And my question is if you noticed there were competing or different narratives of migration.
Competing or different narratives of migration in some of the family histories that you were hearing, depending on whether those migrants were indigenous or African American, or if that's something that you look at. I was just interested to hear if that was migration was working differently for those two groups.
For African Americans and Native Americans, yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So the folks that I study, a lot of the families that I study are, can you hear me? Mm-hmm. Are both Black and Indian. And depending on whether it's maternal or paternal, things are, they identify differently. But the Chief Stand movement ultimately includes people who are part Creek in particular and Seminole. And in the larger part of it, I think I'm kind of interested in the relationship between freedom and sovereignty, right? But land is central to both, right? And so in kind of African American migration and settlement to Indian territory in search of a more free place, as many of the migrants put it, right? Land was the hallmark of freedom in that period. And that's coming up right against Native American claims to land, right, as a hallmark of sovereignty. And so the discourse is different. I mean, how they're thinking about these things is somewhat different. Certainly the historical origins are different. By the time they're all in Indian territory, both groups having experienced forced and coerced, in many ways, removal or migration, they're fighting for the same stuff, really, when it comes down to it. So, I don't know if that's a partial answer to that question.
Sure.
I'd like to address really a comment, really, about difficulty of doing emotion, history of emotions. And I think one of the interesting things about that is it's been done for a long time. For anyone who's done history from the documentation of intimate life through epistolary archives, etc. And I'll give you an example. So the military historian Joanna Burke wrote two fantastic books about the emotions of face-to-face battlefield, face-to-face killing and atrocity, and then another book on the history of fear. And both of those books are basically done on the analysis of the enormous history archive in the Imperial War Museum. And I myself have done a lot of work on the history of the experience of Carlton illness and the life of the interior in England during the Enlightenment. So I think that before there was something that sort of structured around the history of the emotions, I think that anyone trying to... I think that what was absent in that kind of history of the emotions, the history of the emotions that was before it had been identified as such, was that there wasn't this attempt to put the emotionality of historical figures on the couch. I think that the psychohistory aspect, was absent in a different type of maybe more materiality sort of approach to that kind of history.
No, I absolutely agree with you that this is a much longer history that goes back. I mean, one of the key texts that's always mentioned is Lucien Febvre's text in 1942, sort of basically asking for a history of emotions, or even Norbert Elias' process of civilization. That's right, yeah. The problem with people like Elias and to some extent Febvre is, however, that they are very much attached to this idea that there's this clear dichotomy between emotion and reason. They always see emotions as an expression of irrationalism. Yes. And this is something I think that, this is where sort of more recent psychological or even neuroscientific research comes in that has made very clear that this is simply not tenable. So, and then I think it's opened up new possibilities for history of emotion that divorces it from this older view that emotions are somehow sort of relegated to the realm of the irrational, to reason's other, basically. And I also would make a distinction to this sort of psychohistory, which was popular in the 1970s or so. It was very much informed by psychoanalysis and sort of tried to do what I just said we probably can't do, which is to get at the sort of interior of people and sort of figure out, I don't know whether Hitler's childhood says anything about what he did later on, and I don't find this a very sort of promising project. And
it did a disservice, actually.
Right.
I think that the psychohistory, this 1970s.
That's right, yeah. I mean, there are some examples of the use of psychoanalysis, I think, that are, extremely interesting. Lyndall Roper's book, this sort of early modern historian on witchcraft, is one of them, which is really excellent. But I think most of the recent history of emotions actually does not draw on psychoanalysis and more on, sort of cognitive psychology.
So I think we have time for one last quick question. I want to be respectful of the time because we have a panel following immediately at 1:30. That's only a 45-minute panel. So one last.
Okay, so this is a good question. I was thinking about this in your presentation, Frank, and it's also for Roxanne. And quick question: to what extent is liberalism based on a lie?
On what?
On a lie. And the lie is that liberalism is all about reason, when liberalism is all about fear. But in order to create reason, it displaces fear as the eternal other.
Right.
Because what all of you are talking about is an otherness of some kind of displacement.
Quick answer.
Go for it.
Well,
Great question.
I think this idea of fear as liberalism's other is a sort of peculiar post-totalitarian construction too for the post-war period, and you have these sort of liberal political theorists like Judith Sklar who say that the primary goal of a liberal regime is to keep citizens free of fear. Of course, freedom from fear is the sort of ideological motive in some ways for the Second World War in this country. So you have this sort of sense that these two things are sort of diametrically opposed, which they are absolutely not. And that's something that I also want to show in my project, that there were certain moments when fear was actually very instrumental for democratization. And then if you go back further in time, this is also, it's a good example. Tocqueville said that anxiety was actually central to democracy in this country, as opposed to, he talked about status anxiety, sort of more equal society, people would lose status, as opposed to sort of the fear of the state in an absolutist regime. So you have these predecessors who actually sort of challenged this alleged opposition between liberalism and fear.
I think we're going to have to...
I don't think we have time. It'd be like liberalism, when, where, what context, who. It's too big.
So I want to thank you and thank all the panelists for this really interesting session.